Hello, and welcome back to That AuDHD Teacher. I'm Emily, an early childhood teacher, late diagnosed ADHD, and someone who spends quite a lot of time trying to understand why my brain does things the way it does. And today we're talking about something that I think a lot of autistic and ADHD people will probably recognize, and that is change. And that doesn't necessarily mean huge life changes. I'm talking about little changes, like when the plan changes ever so slightly. Someone's being late, maybe a meeting's being moved to a different time, or an appointment. Maybe someone different is at work that you weren't expecting, or something taking longer than you expected, or really just anything that wasn't planned in your routine being different. And people might have different experiences with this. So some people might hear those things and be like, that's totally fine. Or maybe when you hear those things, your brain immediately goes, wait, what? That wasn't the plan. And you sort of go into fight or flight mode. And I think that's something that is quite often misunderstood because when people hear that autistic people struggle with change, I think sometimes people assume that they can't cope with anything ever being different. And that's not actually what I'm talking about because autistic people can cope with change. We go through changes all the time and we go through big changes and small changes, big things from moving houses or jobs, or even when you're growing up, you change schools, you go to university or you travel, all these different things. We are able to adapt and survive and move on. I am more talking about what change costs you. So, one of the biggest questions I think people ask me all the time is why does change feel so difficult? And one of the main reasons here is predictability, right? Because for many autistic people, I know for myself, having an idea of what's going to happen provides me with a sense of safety and stability. And I can sort of predict what my day is going to look like. I know what I'm preparing myself for. If I know what's going to be happening before it's happening, and I know where I'm going to go, who I'm going to bump into, I know what I need to do to prepare myself, what I need to take. I have that mental map already. But if something changes, that map that I've built no longer works anymore. And you have to create a new one. And for some people, that might sound like a really tiny thing. But for someone like me, it's really not. So instead of thinking about change as in the plan changed, the way I like to think about it is I had already prepared myself for one situation and now I have to mentally reorganize everything. And that takes a lot more energy as well. This is actually something that I'm sure a lot of people do, whether you're neurodivergent or not. But when we think about going to a restaurant, I think that most people look at the menu beforehand, right? And so you've already decided what you're going to order and you sort of start building this mental map of where you might sit and how you're going to get there and where it is, all the steps you have to do in order to get there. And then you've already figured out what you're going to order. And it feels safe because you've built this map in your brain. But then what happens if you get to the restaurant and it's closed? Now, I know that this is kind of an unrealistic scenario because I know for autistic people, we will check these things and make sure beforehand. But just imagine that that's what happened, right? You have to come up with a whole new plan. Not only do you have to look at a different menu and decide what you're going to eat, but you have to figure out where you're even going to eat in the first place. You have to figure out where there's parking. And if you're anything like me, I always stress about parking, not because I can't park, because I just want to make sure that there's enough parking and that it's easy to access. And then it's also the change of time, right? Like things are going to take longer than you expected them to. And I know that there might be some people out there that can adapt really easily to that change. But for me, because I rely really heavily on predictability, it just means that the entire mental plan disappears and you're having to rebuild it on the spot. For me, that's a really, really huge experience. And I have a very emotional reaction to change as well. I think I talked about this in a couple episodes back where I had to have surgery and it was changed at the last minute and I was just inconsolable. And I did adapt to it eventually, but I need a lot of forewarning for things. So very abrupt, very last minute changes really throw me off. And I sort of have this emotional reaction for a while and my brain turns off. And once I've kind of processed it a little bit more, I can come out the other side and make a new plan. But it's that in between moment that's really hard. And I think That's the part that people don't necessarily understand. And this is where logic doesn't really come into play here because it might be something really small. So if someone says to you, but it's only a small change, we can't think of it that way because our brains don't actually respond to things purely based on objectively how big they are, right? Because it doesn't matter how small something is, it can still require lots of mental adjustment. So when someone says to you, why are you so upset? Like it's not a big deal at all, that is really, really unhelpful. So I feel like it's really important here to try and understand why change affects us the way it does. And it's just not helpful to tell someone in that situation something like that because just because something isn't a big deal, it doesn't mean that your nervous system experiences it any less. Some people might be really good at thinking logical, but in these situations, I know I am not logical at all. And it makes no sense to the people around me, but my nervous system is not being logical. Another thing that I also think is worth thinking about here is anticipation and the role that it plays, because I know that change can be the difficult part for some people. It is for me, but for some people, it's not actually the change itself. It's the anticipatory anxiety, right? It's everything leading up to it. So if you know that something's going to happen in the future, if something's happening next week, you might spend lots of your time thinking about it. So by the time that that event actually happens, you've already spent an enormous amount of energy thinking about it and preparing for it. I think that this is one of those things that is really difficult to explain to people who don't actually experience it themselves because you might be able to show up to whatever event you're going to and they might be like, well, what's the problem? You're here, right? But they didn't experience or see any of the preparation that had to happen beforehand. It's almost like a mental rehearsal. And there's so much effort involved in just getting you ready for it, let alone the event itself. And then when we think about ADHD, so for me, that is very much my autistic side speaking. But what's interesting is that ADHD adds a whole different layer to this. And I also talked about this last time as well. And it's really interesting to kind of delve into the different layers and all the different opposite things that can happen when you have both autism and ADHD. Because quite often, if you have ADHD, our brains seek novelty and new things can be really exciting and it can actually be really stimulating. But at the same time, we can also struggle when something unexpected happens and it sounds super contradictory. And it honestly feels really contradictory because you can want something new, but then not want something unexpected. And this happens to me all the time. I think like 2 years ago, I was explaining to my doctor about how much I hate cooking. And she asked me why I hated it. And I said, well, it's too stressful. But then I also said that it's too boring. And she was like, none of that makes sense because they're just completely different things. But that's the reality of living with an ADHD brain is that sometimes these things can be contradictory. Another thing to think about here is what is driving the change? Are you choosing the change or is something unexpected or someone else choosing the change? Because that's actually different. So if you decide that you want to go and do something new, that can be okay. But if someone else decides that you're going to do something new, then that can feel completely different because now you're not choosing the change. And that's not to say that you don't want other people to choose things. It's just that you might need the time to mentally prepare for it. Because if the change just comes out of the blue, then you didn't have time to prepare for that. And you're having to shift gears when you're just not ready. I don't know if that kind of explains the reasoning behind how you can be spontaneous, but then still struggle with unexpected change. It takes a lot of untangling to kind of go through ADHD and figure out all these opposite sides of things, honestly. Another thing that's really important in terms of the change conversation is also around transitions. So transition is basically just moving from one thing to another. And we do this all the time, every day. You know, if we think about going from work to home or when we're leaving the house to go somewhere, you know, transitions exist every day, all the time. But they also require us to stop one mental process and begin another, which can be really difficult if we're deeply focused on something. If you've ever been completely absorbed in something that you, particularly that you really wanted to do, and then someone says, okay, it's time to go, it's not that you don't understand what they're telling you or what you have to do. It's that there's actually a mental gap between being ready to stop and actually stopping. And that's what makes transitions so difficult. And this is something that happens all the time with children when we think about it. And we try and do things by giving children warnings. We might be like, okay, it's 5 more minutes and then we're going to go. But that isn't necessarily enough for some people. And I find the same for me, even as an adult. I need a lot more warning and different cues. I could go a lot into this, but just to give you an idea, some of the supports that we can actually implement for transitions are warnings, of course, but then also visual cues, knowing exactly what's happening next. Sometimes for children, using social stories is a really good tool, or they just might need to actually finish what they're doing. I think sometimes stepping back and asking the question, why are we getting them to stop, is really helpful. And this goes the same for adults as well. I think that everything in life can feel really urgent sometimes, but feeling urgent doesn't mean that it is urgent. I think being kind to ourselves when this happens, because we live in such a busy world where everything's just go, go, go all the time. And sometimes it is really hard to transition. I have this struggle every single day. I think I saw a video once where someone was talking about having a shower and how it feels like an event. And I really relate to this because it honestly is an event. Like having to put in all the effort to get up, to get to the shower, to get undressed, to get into the shower. And then once you're in the shower, you don't want to leave the shower and you have to do it all over again. And it's just such a huge mental thing to do for some people. But when we're talking about transitions, I think one thing that can make them feel difficult is that feeling of being unfinished. Like if you've started doing something and you're really into it, but then you suddenly have to stop, your brain doesn't always feel like the task is finished and it might just still be ticking over, thinking about it constantly. So then you're suddenly asked to change direction and that can feel super jarring. Sometimes this is why transitions that have a really clear ending can be a little bit easier. Again, it really depends on the person and what works for you because what works for me might not work for you. But if you're able to break it down and sort of put it into pieces and you work out a place where you feel like it's finished enough for you to move on, then maybe that's the way to go. Like if you're watching a TV show and you go, okay, after this episode, then I'll go to bed. We all know that never happens, but just an example. The other part that I think kind of deserves its own conversation around this is the uncertainty. So when it comes to change, you might be able to adapt to the change and cope to the change perfectly well when you know exactly what the change is. Because if someone gives you specific details, then you can sort of start building that mental map. But if someone gives you really vague instructions, then it's a lot harder for your brain to start preparing for it because you have too many gaps in the knowledge and your information, and you don't actually know what you're preparing for. And what tends to happen when we have that gap is our brain starts scanning for all the different possibilities, and quite often it jumps to the worst case scenarios because your brain is just trying to protect you. So you'll start thinking about all the negative things. It will start coming up with lots of worst case scenarios because you are trying to prepare yourself for the worst that can happen. I don't think that human brains do well on very vague information. I think explicit information is the best way to go here because then our brain doesn't have to try and fill in those gaps because when it has too much mental space, it will just try and fill those gaps. And especially if you suffer from anxiety, this is just one of the worst things that you can do. And it just makes things way more stressful than they need to be. Your brain is ultimately just trying to protect you, trying to get you to survive. And I think this is also where people can confuse anxiety with autism because they definitely overlap. There's even research to show that autistic people have their own sort of form of anxiety that's different to other anxiety, but we won't go into that. But anxiety and autism definitely overlap. So I don't think that the answer here is to just stop worrying. It's actually to get as much information as possible and just being able to provide whatever context and information you have to a person. because it just makes that uncertainty feel so much more manageable. And I think that this is something that I've been learning along my journey as well, because sometimes I have such strong emotional reactions to things, like when my surgery changed, for example. After I had some time to reflect, I realized that it wasn't about the situation itself because it didn't matter when I had surgery. It was the uncertainty and all the mental preparation that I had to go through for that. So then when things changed suddenly, I had to build a whole new map. And it was at very short notice as well. And it just became too overwhelming. Sometimes because I've spent all that energy doing all that work, I'm just really tired, so my capacity is a lot lower. So when something does change, it can be harder to sort of bounce back from. I've also had to learn over this journey that being able to cope with something doesn't mean that it's not hard. And that's something that I really want to emphasize as well, because you can absolutely cope with something and still find it incredibly exhausting. So when a change does happen, you can cope through it, but it doesn't mean that it didn't take a lot of energy, and it doesn't mean that it wasn't easy. I think your nervous system can experience it in different ways. And I just think it's important to remember and hopefully be validating for people who have spent their whole lives being told, but you handled it so well, because it isn't always easy and people don't always see that, because maybe you handle it fine at the time, but then they didn't see the aftermath of what happened afterwards, because there is always sort of a downfall to these things, which also connects back to masking, because we can appear totally in control and totally happy to other people. So they might get a picture of us from the outside being like, oh, wow, they're a super easygoing person. But internally, you are working so incredibly hard to try and reorganize all your thoughts that you become so exhausted later that you have to stay in bed for 2 days, right? So it's just kind of being aware of your reactions and what you're doing and the aftermath that comes with that as well, especially if we are masking, because we do need to remember to look after ourselves, because all of that accumulates and it all contributes to burnout, which is not a good place to be in. So I kind of talked about some of these things throughout the episode, but I thought it might be helpful to just talk about the things that might actually help. So you kind of have a tangible list of strategies you can use. And I don't think that there is one magic solution, and there's definitely not a one size fits all. I think we're all different. So you just have to find what works for you, which can sometimes be a bit tricky. It just requires a bit of trial and error. And I don't think that any of these strategies will solve it. It just might make things a bit easier. So the first one I would say is just preparation, which is probably something we're doing already. But the sooner you know that something's going to change, the more time you're able to give yourself to process it, even if the change is small, right? The second one would be clear information. So instead of being super vague saying, oh, we're going to do something different, be as clear as possible and say, we're going to do XYZ instead. It sort of gives us more clearer information that can help our brain process. The third one is visualizing the new plan. So, because our brain may have already built up a mental map, we need to replace it with a new one. And sometimes you need a little bit of time to do that as well. So, I know that's not always achievable. The fourth one, which can actually be a super helpful tool, is having a backup plan. And that's not to say that you're jumping to the worst case scenario, thinking that things are always going to go wrong, but you don't need it until you need it, right? So it's always good to have a plan A and a plan B, just because then you don't have to completely change the mental map and you don't have to cope with that last minute change. And while it might not be ideal, you still have some kind of predictability there. Number five, probably not something you're expecting me to say, and it's definitely not a solution, but is really important to actually allow ourselves to have our reaction and feel our reaction. I think it's just important to remember that we don't have to mask and we don't have to pretend that things aren't difficult when they are. We also don't have to mask our reactions for the comfort of other people as well, is important to remember, because the experience can be genuinely difficult for us. And I don't think it's fair that we have to hide our reaction just to try and make other people feel comfortable. It's really important for us to actually feel our reactions because it helps with processing them as well. Because at the end of the day, I don't think that there is any one solution to this. We can have these strategies and we can have everything in place, but it doesn't mean that things aren't ever going to be difficult because they are. I know that it doesn't matter how prepared I am, how many things I have in my toolkit, I will still get thrown off by something unexpected. But I also think that's where the self awareness comes in and just trying to understand what's actually underneath the reaction. Once we've had time to actually have our reaction and then process it as well, because all of that is information for the future. So, like I do in my other podcast, I sort of like to leave you with something to ponder. So, today it only makes sense that you think about the last time that a plan may have changed unexpectedly. Like it could have been really, really small, but just thinking about what actually happened and what actually made that change difficult. Like, was it the transition? Was it the feeling that you didn't have control or you didn't know what was happening? Like, what was it that actually made it hard? Because understanding that makes it easier for us to then work out what support we need going forward. I just think that all of this is information, and the more information we have, the better we're able to understand ourselves and help ourselves and those around us as well. It's not just about us. I think that's really important to remember that other people can still be struggling with the same things that we are, and just allowing ourselves and others to say that actually this is really hard and that's okay. I think that there are a lot of negative opinions about being able to say, this is really hard, but it's really important to give yourself that grace, I feel. But anyway, I could go down a long rabbit hole about all of this, as always. But thank you so much for spending this time with me today. And I really hope that this episode has helped you understand why change and unpredictability can sometimes feel so much bigger than it appears from the outside. And if you have ever been told that you're dramatic or you're overreacting just because something's changed, I hope you just really remember that coping with something doesn't always mean it's easy and your experience is always valid. And if today's episode resonated with you, I'd love it if you followed that AuDHD teacher on whatever podcast platform you listen on. And if you have a moment to leave a rating or a review, it really, really helps because it helps other people discover these conversations as well. You can also find me on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Threads at That AuDHD Teacher, where I keep saying I share more about my life. I'm bad at it, but I will keep trying. But until next time, remember that different doesn't mean broken, it simply means different. Take care, and I'll see you in the next episode.